Welcome. This last week, I'm going to be talking about giving a research presentation and then illustrating it as well. And all of these slides are written around the idea, which is normal in normal years in this class, that students are going to present their final research papers in a short presentation to the class. So it's kind of neat. We get like a symposium at the end of the semester where everybody gets to give a brief talk about what they've been working on. Unfortunately, I decided to eliminate that this semester. I just thought with the shortened schedule and the logistics of having people on 3 continents, it was just going to be impossible to have this work out. So we are skipping the general research presentations this semester. However, this is still a super important skill. And I've already encouraged all of you to actually apply for a real conference at some point. And if you do that, of course, you're going to need to know something about how to give a research presentation. So these slides are geared to some extent towards giving the research presentation in class, but everything in here is also going to apply to giving a research presentation anywhere else. And a lot of this is also going to apply to writing your final project up in paper form. So let me start with that. As a reminder here, we studied this sort of classical format of a lab report or a research paper in the empirical sciences, and not everybody is going to end up studying a topic in here that lends itself really nicely to this 4-part format, but a lot of you will. And so I wanted to briefly go through this format again and remind you what I'm going to be looking for when I get your final papers here. And even if you don't follow this 4-part arrangement, which might not be appropriate for some people's topics, all of the kinds of information that I'm discussing in here are still going to need to be in your research proposal, which is the final project for this class. I've had a bunch of questions about how long and what format the final paper should be in. And in general, I don't give page limits for this kind of assignment. And I know it's a pain in the butt when you want to know how long it should be, and I can't really tell you. But there's a reason for that. I mean, you need to be able to clearly and rigorously and thoroughly introduce your topic, and that can take a very different amount of space depending on what your topic is and how you write. In general, what I've been telling people is that successful papers in this class tend to be anywhere from 15 to maybe 25 or 30 pages, double spaced. Of course, that's very rough guideline. I occasionally get papers that are shorter than that are okay. I occasionally get papers that are longer than that, which I don't love, but they can still get good grades. I do have to read all of these in detail, so I'd appreciate not getting 40 and 50 page papers, although, sometimes it's just irreducibly difficult to get everything you need to get into a shorter amount of space, and I get that. In terms of formatting, it should be formatted like a normal research paper. I don't have any really detailed requirements for that. For references, you probably want to get used to using APA style. That's going to be the most relevant style guide in both linguistics and TESOL. So I've mentioned this in earlier lectures. If you want to look up APA style on the web, there's lots and lots of good web tutorials on it. I wouldn't dive too deep into the details of APA style because it's always changing and it's really pretty arbitrary. But again, the basic idea is that when you give a reference, I need to be able to locate the reference that you're talking about. As long as I can do that from the information that you've given me, that should be fine. But in general, when in doubt, use the APA style. It's the American Psychological Association. Okay, so this classical format, if you are going this direction, consists of 4 parts. There's the introduction, where you lay out the topic that you're studying and how you're going to study it. There's the methods section, where you describe in detail what you did, or in the case of our research proposal, what you would like to do, or what you think would be a good thing to do in order to study the questions that you've proposed in the introduction. In the results section, normally you would explore and describe the data that you've gathered in whatever kind of detail is relevant to the kinds of data that you're working with, whether that's descriptions of linguistic constructions or quantitative data from an experiment or whatever you've got, you want to go through that in some detail in the results section. Of course, for this class, I don't expect you to actually do the research. In fact, I expect that you probably won't. And so what you're going to do in the results section here is talk about what you think the results might look like, a couple possible patterns. Well, here's one thing that might happen if I did that study. Here's another thing that might happen. Here's a third thing that could happen. And then the discussion section is going to be talking about what those different patterns of results that you've discussed in the preceding section would mean with reference to the questions in the introduction. How are we going to use some of the patterns of results that I hypothesized about in this sort of imaginary results section? How are we going to use those to answer questions that I posed in the introduction? Sometimes there's a sort of concluding section there as well. But that's the basic 4-part format. Right, and so let's go through this in a little bit more detail. Possibly the most important part of the introduction is this framing part. This really determines whether or not the reader is going to get engaged with the paper or the presentation, whether they're going to understand everything that happens afterwards. So what do you need to do here? You need to describe the general phenomenon that's being investigated more broadly than the actual narrow sort of concrete examples that you're using in your work. You need to describe a little bit more broadly what the general area is about, including usually with reference to previous published work in that area. And then from that general description, you're going to want to narrow in on a more specific phenomenon that might be the way your general area interacts with some other factor that you're going to study in the paper. And again, if there's previous research on this, you need to cite that or explain why, based on previous research, this could be an interesting thing to study. And then it's very important here to also lay out background claims. That's what I'm calling them. Things like assumptions or premises. These are things that you're not necessarily going to be testing in your research, but that you're using as a basic foundation or a starting point in order to ask meaningful questions. We always need to make some kinds of assumptions about what kinds of constructs exist, and sometimes assumptions about the connections between constructs and different empirical phenomena. And you want to lay out those background claims as clearly as possible so that somebody with no background in your specific area would be able to trace the chain of reasoning of why are you measuring this thing in this particular way in order to try to answer questions about these concepts or constructs. And of course, you want to give plausible reasons to believe your background claims if you can find some evidence out there. And then finally, the introduction should explain why your topic is interesting, right? So why is this something that somebody might want to study? Right? You'll want to introduce a clear research question in your introduction. And note that for the final paper, this introduction section is going to be probably the bulk of the paper for most of you. This will probably take up more than half the space of the paper. And I'm really looking for you to clearly lay out a research area and show that you're good at summarizing things, at synthesizing information, and at asking meaningful questions in some area of research. So you want to introduce some unexplained aspect of the thing that you're investigating. So while we have all these previous results I've just discussed, there's this other question about how my area works. And in this paper, I'm going to propose the following answer to that question. So you want to explain what's the thing that we don't know that you're trying to find out. And if you have an answer, then you might want to at least briefly summarize what that answer is going to be like. Depending on what your topic is, most of you are working in areas with a lot of pre-existing theory of different types about the question of interest. And so you're also going to want to lay out in the introduction what different kinds of theoretical approaches or frameworks, how they approach the topic, and what they predict the answer to the question should be. So you've now laid out some background on different ways that people approach your research area, and you've laid out some questions about things we don't know. Now you want to try as clearly as possible to explain what those different approaches predict the answer to your question should be. And the way you're going to do that is by trying to make clear the relationship between constructs that figure in each of these theories, right? So, monitor theory recognizes this distinction between two different kinds of learning and acquisition, and that ought to show up in the question that I'm asking when I measure the following thing. This particular theory predicts that I should find these results. Right? You want to translate theoretical predictions into specific empirical outcomes if you're proposing some kind of an empirical study. Right? That's the basic idea here. And usually, what people make of your paper, how strong they judge your paper to be, how likely they are to believe the claims in your paper, it actually doesn't rely primarily on how good your experiment is or how well you analyze the results. Usually, the main determinant of whether people believe your claims in your paper is how well you actually outline or make the case that a specific theory maps meaningfully onto possible outcomes of your experiment. So this is one of the most important sections of at least an empirical research paper, is showing how the specific empirical results that you're going to eventually be getting actually match up to theories and constructs and predictions that are out there in the literature, right? So that's the introduction. And, in this class, it's fine for 60, 70% of the paper to be taken up with this introduction. This is by far the most difficult, the most involved, the most detailed part of this research proposal. And it's the part that shows me that you've really managed to break into the primary research literature, and that you've gained some skills at reading and understanding and summarizing previous research. So this is going to be a big component of your final research proposal for this class. Also, if you ever end up giving a research talk, this should be a large component of a research talk as well. There's certain maybe specific settings where everybody studies the same kinds of topics, and you might want to just spend most of your talk diving into the details of the results or the data that you got. But most of the time, it's going to be more important to expand this introduction section and make sure that your audience is with you. And that holds for research papers as well. You need to make sure that your audience is able to read along with your reasoning, is able to trace the arguments that you're making and understand what kinds of questions you're proposing and what kinds of answers you're proposing. Some people like to end the introduction with what I'm calling a pre-summary, which is basically just a paragraph or a few sentences that outlines the structure of the remaining sections of the paper. If you're doing the sort of 4-part classical research format, this is probably not necessary. Everybody knows how that organization works. But if you're using any other kind of a structure for your paper, it's probably worth going through and saying, in section 2, I talk about the following things. In section 3, I do this. In section 4, and so on and so forth. This can be a very useful thing to put in for a reader or in a talk because it allows the audience to build up some expectations about what's coming next, and that helps people navigate a research paper or a research talk. It helps them situate themselves and know where they came from and where they're heading next. And it creates a coherent narrative about what your work is about. Right? Methods sections tend to be sort of neglected in these papers. But the basic idea here is that you want to give the reader enough information that if they needed to, they could go out and do your research all over again by themselves and they would get the same results. Now that is, of course, an ideal, and in practice, it's actually quite difficult to provide enough detail that anybody would actually be able to do that, but you should try and get as far as you can. This is frequently a problem in more psychologically oriented work, including in psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics. People often don't provide even the minimal necessary level of methodological detail to know what they were studying or what specific materials they got their data from. Sometimes they do. But this is a persistent problem in the psychological sciences in particular, with sort of disastrous results pertaining to the reliability of some psychological results. So it's very important. Now, what might you want to include in your methods section? Well, if you're doing an experiment, then you want to give references to similar published experiments. So we're using the X, Y, and Z paradigm that Smith and Jones popularized in 1994, so on and so forth. You want to describe the data that you're going to collect, right? We're going to ask people to push buttons and log which buttons they pushed. We're going to record speakers saying the following sounds and study the recordings. We're going to have people read words on a screen and click to get the next word, and we're going to record their reading times for each word. You want to describe the subjects that participate in the experiment. Who are they? How many are they? Are there any important properties of those subjects? What languages did they speak? And so on and so forth. You want to describe how you got the data. These are the materials we used. We printed all these words on PowerPoint slides, and then we had people click through them in order to read them. And these were the actual words. They're in an appendix or something like that. How did you present them? Was it on a screen? Was it on a piece of paper? Where it's relevant, you might want to talk about the software or the hardware that you use. So like I used a USB condenser mic and recorded speakers in the Amadeus software. And then the acoustic analyses were done in Prot version 3.6. And then a reference to the authors of the Prot program, or so on and so forth. And then this is important. You want to explain the instructions that you gave to your subjects, or if they're short enough, you want to just print them. Right? Subjects were given the following instructions. You are about to read a series of words on a series of slides. For each slide, please read the word silently to yourself, and then read it out loud. As naturally as possible, or whatever the instructions that are going to be given to subjects, you want to include that. It can actually be kind of important what you tell subjects to do. It can change the results of your experiments. If you're doing statistical analysis, which nobody in this class is going to be doing, but in general, if you're doing quantitative analyses, you might want to describe those analyses in the methods section, especially if you're doing anything complex at all. In my work, I use a lot of sort of fancy regression modeling, which is a kind of statistical model. And it's usually worth going through in the methods section exactly what software you're using to do that, how you're going to decide which of the parameters of that model are important or not important, and so on and so forth. So methods, you really want to tell them about every stage of your research undertaking. Now, of course, in your final proposal for this class, because you're not actually doing the research, I want some outline of how you think you would approach your particular proposal on a step-by-step basis. Like, what are the actual physical steps you would need to take in order to carry out the experiment? And of course, if you don't know every single detail of every single technical aspect of this, that's okay. But I just want to get a sense of what you've been thinking about methodologically, and also know that you're understanding principles of design and principles of analysis. Again, for the final paper here, because you're not going to carry out the research, for the results section, you'll be talking about possible patterns of results. And I don't want a statement like, I know that the results are going to come out this way, and that's what this means. I want you to think about what different patterns of results might mean. If you're doing an experiment where you already know the outcome, then there's no point in doing the experiment. This should be an experiment that hopefully teaches us something or answers some question. And then, of course, you'd want to explain what would you conclude from each of these patterns of results. Now, the discussion section is going to come back to the things that you discussed in the introduction section, these questions, these theories, these frameworks, these approaches. You're going to explain the theoretical consequences of different outcomes and their broader significance, right? So how would specific outcomes bear on our assessment of these different theories that I've been talking about in the introduction section? And then, of course, hopefully in the introduction, you've at least begun to explain why the broad area that you're researching is interesting. So in the discussion section, you want to also explain more broadly how these results contribute to our understanding of the broader area of interest, right? What did we learn about the world from doing this? And then finally, you might want to suggest some other types of questions that would be good to answer. That's often related to limitations of your study, things you weren't able to get into your study, or possible directions that you might want to pursue the research in next time, or in the next paper, or in your dissertation, or whatever. Okay, I'm going to talk about presentations in a separate video, but all of this advice was about the organization not only of a presentation, but also of your final project, your research proposal for this class.